final speaker for this session is Sabby Sagall. Sabby is an author and a lifelong and very dedicated socialist and campaigner for Palestinian liberation. Please welcome Sabby Sagall.
Yeah, in fact, also a self-hating Jew. Well, comrades, difficult to follow the last two speakers, but I'll do my best. Now, you all know the name Theodor Herzl. He was the founder of modern political Zionism. Well, his deputy was a man called Max Nordau, who said, "Our aspirations point to Palestine as a compass point to the north. Therefore, we must orient ourselves towards those powers, Germany and Turkey, under whose influence Palestine happens to be." And so the Zionists, from the very outset, were quite clear that to establish a Zionist state in Palestine, they had to be to court, to win the favor of whichever imperialist power happened to be dominating the Middle East. In that sense, Zionism and imperialism have always been closely linked. And again, Theodor Herzl visited Russia, and he met with a man called Vyacheslav Pleve in 1903. Pleve was a notoriously anti-Semitic Russian Tsarist minister of the interior who had presided over one of the worst pogroms in Eastern Europe. And Herzl said to Pleve, "Encourage the Jews to leave Russia and you have fewer revolutionaries." Now, in 1917, as I'm sure comrades are aware, Lord Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, issued the infamous Balfour Declaration, in which he pledged support for a national home for the Jewish people. He was careful not to use the word Jewish state at that point. This was the same Balfour who in 1905, as Foreign Secretary, issued the Aliens Act. In 1905, trying to keep Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, trying to prevent them from entering Britain, people like my family. So, fast forwarding a bit, in 1916, Britain and France, in the middle of the First World War, signed a secret accord called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes and Picot were two civil servants, British and French. They divided the Ottoman Empire into spheres of influence, spheres of control. The agreement disregarded completely ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries as they had existed for hundreds of years in the Middle East, and allocated control to Britain and France, the new colonial powers dominating the Middle East. France gained direct control of Lebanon and indirect control of Syria, while Britain took control of Iraq and the Persian Gulf. Palestine was designated as an area of international control, and this led in 1920 to the League of Nations, placing Palestine under a British mandate. This mandate lasted until 1947. You see, now the Zionists were careful not to demand the departure of the British colonialists from Palestine until Jewish immigration had increased. You see, even in 1948, when Israel was declared, the Palestinians had a majority of 2-1 over the Jewish population. So the Zionists waited for the Jewish immigration to increase until there was a substantial Jewish population in Palestine before they demanded a British colonial departure. So they were always depended on imperialism, or whichever imperialist power happened to dominate the Middle East. Now, the United States, of course, emerged from World War II as the world's dominant imperialist power. But at that point, the Russians were also very, very powerful. The Soviet Union, of course, had suffered enormously in World War II, but emerged, as the second great world power. And at one point, the Zionists looked to the Soviet Union to support them in their struggle to evict the Palestinian population, and indeed, early supplier of arms to the Haganah, the Israeli militia, the Zionist militia. Early supply of arms was the Soviet Union, arms that were siphoned through Czechoslovakia. Now, as I said, the Middle East area is vital to Western capitalism because of its large oil reserves. Even today, the oil reserves in the Middle East represent 48% of world total reserves. You see, the boundaries separating the different Arab nations today were imposed by imperialism so as to enable imperialism to exploit those reserves, in particular, let's say, the oil reserves. So the State of Israel was established in 1948, and it proceeded to offer its services, as it had done previously, to whichever imperialist power happened to be dominating the Middle East. As I said, the first world power that the Zionists looked to was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union supplied arms to the Zionist militia as they expelled the Palestinians and waged what they call the War of Independence, which we call the Nakba. Now, the War of 1956, comrades are old enough to remember, as I am, the War of 1956 followed Egyptian President Nasser, his nationalization of the Suez Canal, removing it from British and French control, and he imposed a blockade to prevent all Israeli passage of ships through the Suez Canal. Now, Britain and France invaded Egypt to prevent that happening. And they invaded Egypt, which, however, brought them into conflict with the Americans. The Americans were seeking now to impose their control over the Middle East. So you had this conflict between British and French imperialism on the one hand, American imperialism on the other. And President Eisenhower, at the time, warned that if Britain continued with its invasion of Egypt, then the United States would sell off the American government's sterling bonds, which would have been a serious financial blow to Britain. So the result was that the Americans had forced the British and the French to withdraw from the Suez Canal area. And of course, that crisis enormously strengthened Nasser's standing in the Arab world, and it indicated the end of British and French domination of the Middle East. So America was now the undisputed imperial power in control of the oil reserves and so on. And I'll just finish with by saying that today the United States, as everybody knows, is Israel's unstinting patron, ally, and supplier, economic and military supplier. Now, it's interesting because the Americans don't, strictly speaking, need Middle East oil anymore. The United States is self-sufficient in oil, but the Middle East has 55% of the world's known oil reserves. And because of those oil reserves, the Middle East has become the cauldron of inter-imperialist rivalry between the United States and China. The reason is that China is heavily dependent on energy imports, which account for about 53% of China's crude oil imports. The United States wants to continue supporting the Middle East in order to prevent the Chinese, as far as it can, from gaining control over Middle East oil. From that point of view, Israel remains a vital strategic partner to the United States, and the United States will do everything in its power to assist to defend the genocidal state of Israel. I'll finish it there, comrades. Thank you for listening.